And I'm happy to welcome you to this Distinguished Author Series event featuring William Drozdiak, author of this book, Fractured Continent, Europe's Crises, and the Fate of the West. Let me just talk a minute or two about what we've done over past years here with this book program. Past books over the last 8 or 9 years that I've been doing this, they've tracked concerns in places that caught the attention of the international community and indeed of the United Nations itself. Those places were places in the Middle East during the Arab Spring uprisings and during the campaign of the Islamic State. They were conflicted areas of Africa, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kenya, Sudan, South Sudan. Places in Southeast Asia, particularly vulnerable to natural and climate change catastrophes. And individual countries with impact beyond their borders, like Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Russia, and China. The books we had before were on all those kinds of subjects. But more recently, our attention has drawn closer to home. The US, of course, because of the coming to power of a government and a president who has seriously disrupted the conduct of foreign policy and international relations, but also, and most importantly for tonight's conversation, Europe, where a noble post-war experiment of global democratic order seems to be at risk. It was unanticipated, at least I didn't anticipate it, because my generation, we were lulled into thinking we had reached what Francis Fukuyama famously called in 1992 the end of history, the uncontested triumph of rules-based liberal democracy as the most widely accepted and agreed upon model of governing. So I was really pleased to be able to invite to IPI Bill Drozdiak, an old friend, and a distinguished journalist whose specialty for 3 decades has been Europe. Bill has written a knowing and important book that, while being wide-ranging and historical, keeps becoming more and more relevant day by day as Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, and various authoritarian leaders and once fringe political parties jockey for leadership and influence on the continent. And all the while, with the great unilateralist America firster, Donald Trump, taking aim from abroad at the whole enterprise. For those of you who have read Michael Wolff's Fire and Fury, you will know that the bad guys in the White House are identified as, quote, globalists, unquote. Bill's book is for sale at the door, and I'm going to make sure we finish up with plenty of time for Bill to sign purchase copies and to chat with you. Now, even though Europe is enjoying a significant economic recovery, Bill's subtitle, The Fate of the West, is hardly overstated, as we see some European countries turning their backs on the transatlantic model and doing things like shutting down the free press, politicizing courts, disparaging the rule of law, marginalizing the rights of minorities, and blocking the free movement of people. So Bill's book could not be more timely and topical. So please join me in welcoming to IPI Bill Drozdiak.
Thank you very much, Warren, an old friend from our days in journalism together, and it's a pleasure to be here at IPI, and thank you all for coming. Well, as Warren pointed out, my time in Europe goes back many years, and I suppose the genesis of this book can be traced back to the time when I was the foreign editor of the Washington Post, and the Berlin Wall opened up on November 9th, 1989. And I went over there to supervise our coverage and also to do some writing about how the East Germans would react to what they would see of the West for the first time. And I remember arriving there on November 9th, and the East Germans were allowed across the wall. The West Germans had allocated some pocket money for them, about 50 Deutschmarks each. And I thought, where will they go? And I said, of course, they're going to go to the shopping emporium known as KaDeWe on the Kurfürstendamm. And sure enough, I went up to the 6th floor, which was a gleaming place of gourmet foods everywhere. And it was just packed with East Germans who were just gawking at everything. And the lead of my story recounted the image of East Germans standing in front of a huge pyramid of oranges, which they had never seen before, because the only fresh fruit they ever got in communist East Germany was an occasional consignment of bananas sent over by Cuba. But they saw this huge pyramid of oranges, and I heard them saying to each other, you know, the lies. They told us this was all fake, but now we see what it is. And so the lead really was, after that image, was that I was convinced on that day that the East German people would settle at nothing less than equality of living standards. And sure enough, that's what drove the process, I think, of German unification, so that within barely a year and a half, the wall came tumbling down, Germany was reunified, and even the Soviet Union evaporated. So we were then in a situation, as you pointed out, Francis Fukuyama said, the end of history, triumph of liberal internationalism, communism was dead. And at that time, Chancellor Helmut Kohl of Germany, a Christian Democrat, and French President Francois Mitterrand, a socialist, who had a very unique and important partnership despite their differing political views, came together and they realized Europe needs to make a great leap forward. One, to keep Germany anchored in a unifying Europe, but also to keep the momentum going of the European project, which, as you point out, and I strongly believe, is one of the most noble achievements in international diplomacy, in making war impossible, first of all, between France and Germany, which for 5 centuries had been going to war with each other, and also to create a zone of peace and prosperity on a continent that had been ravaged by 2 world wars in the past century. So Kohl and Mitterrand decided that the first thing they would do would be to set a timetable for a single currency, the euro, and Germany would give up its Deutschmark in order to keep the momentum going for for a more united Europe, that they would open up borders under a new Schengen treaty that would show the citizens of Europe that they could move from country to country, as well as using a single currency, and realize that this was indeed on the way to being a United States of Europe. And finally, it was decided that the key institutions of the West, the European Union and NATO, would expand to the East to embrace the new democracies that had thrown off their communist oppressors, and in Central and Eastern Europe. And all 3 of these projects seemed to infuse Europe with a new dynamism. But somewhere along the road, all these projects went off the rails. And I think the main contributing factor was the 2008 financial crisis. And it pointed up the weakness, the inherent weakness of a euro, a one-size-fits-all monetary policy. How can you have the same monetary policy for a strong economy like Germany and a weak economy like Greece? And at the time, Spain was going through a housing bubble that finally burst. And so we saw this all came crashing down in the Greek debt crisis, which is still with us today, although things are looking marginally better. And it almost brought the euro caused the euro to crack up. Secondly, the Schengen Treaty, opening Europe's borders within the members of the European Union, proved to have a weakness when the refugee crisis, growing out of the Syrian civil war, led to hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees coming across from Turkey first into Greece and then moving north. And this led to a strong conflict within the EU. Most notably, as I recount, when Chancellor Merkel woke up on a Saturday morning and couldn't contact her other European peers and decided on humanitarian basis she would allow the refugees to come streaming into Germany. They then had a European summit, and Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, told her, "I'm erecting a barbed wire fence all around my country, and believe me, Madam Chancellor, you will be forced to do the same thing." And she pushed aside her papers, as she told me later, and she said, I stared at him and I told him, I grew up looking at a wall in my face for 35 years, and I'm determined this will not happen again in Europe. So it showed the ferocity of her humanitarian gesture, but of course that led to political problems, which we now see with the rise of populist nationalists, and indeed the Alternative for Deutschland, according to some polls, is now the second strongest party in Germany. And then, of course, the third project, the embrace of the new democracies in Central and Eastern Europe, led to a resurgence of Russian nationalism and aggression. And after Boris Yeltsin was replaced by Vladimir Putin, Putin realized that the way to rally the Russian people was to pick a fight with the West and say that this is an effort to encircle Russia, and therefore we will fight back. First, we saw it in Georgia in 2007, 2008, and most recently with the annexation of Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. So all of these problems, I believe, came together in sort of a perfect storm of crises in 2015 and 2016. So for 2 years, I traveled around Europe reporting on all of these different phenomena. And then this was compounded by the blunder committed by David Cameron to call a referendum on whether Britain should stay in the European Union. In June 2016, the British people voted by 52% to 48% to leave the EU. By March 2019, the negotiations now are in a complete chaotic mess. The Labour Party is now trying to trigger an early election. Today, its leader, Jeremy Corbyn, said, we want to have a soft departure and stay at part of the customs union in an effort to divide the Tory party and trigger new elections. And then, of course, the election of Donald Trump and the message of America First, and during the campaign, he called into question NATO, whether it was obsolete, and attacking our allies in the European Union, saying that they are not strategic assets, but they are actually commercial enemies of the United States. And this is, I think, leading to a succession of trade wars that we could have with our European allies that could be terribly pernicious for the entire Western world. So all of these crises, I think, are still with us. As Warren pointed out, there is a positive sign with the uptick in the economic growth in Europe, but I would argue that even today, the political landscape in Europe is more fragmented than ever. I think there was great hope invested in the election of Emmanuel Macron, who defeated Marine Le Pen, the head of the far-right National Front, and Macron on a platform of strongly pro-European views. He even celebrated his election night rather than not to the Marseillaise, but to the Ode to Joy, Beethoven's Ode to Joy, which is the European anthem. And so certainly Angela Merkel told me, I very much look forward to working with Macron, because I think this could be the partnership that I've been looking for to relaunch Europe. So a lot of this will be determined on next Sunday, March 4th. there will be two key events. One will be whether the Social Democrats accept Merkel's offer of a grand coalition, Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, so they can get this new government in Germany and they can start on a program of reviving Europe in partnership with President Macron of France. And there will be a very important election in Italy, where we have seen the resurgence of Silvio Berlusconi and anti-immigrant parties aligned with him, like the Lega of the North and other right-wing parties. And at the same time, there's the Five Star Movement, which is really something of an anarchic party. But either way, they have squeezed the traditional ruling parties in such a way that they could turn out to be the big victors. So these issues are still with us, and what I've tried to do in this book is to tell American readers that these events in Europe have profound consequences for us, because one of the great achievements in our history has been to be the leader, since in the aftermath of World War II, the leader of the Western liberal order through NATO, through our alliance with other like-minded countries in Western Europe. And it's still a work in progress, and whether we succeed is still open to question. So look forward to having a dialogue with you for the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill and I have a bit of a conversation here for a while, and then in plenty of time, open it up to the floor for questions and comments. Bill, taking right from where you left off, those of us who, I sometimes always say, IPI, we don't take sides on things, but we take sides when it comes to multilateral diplomacy, to international cooperation. So obviously, we're on the side of a successful European Union revival or something that looks like that. And in that connection, I want to ask you to make some judgments, because you know so much. Will this recreated French-German partnership, which after all was how the EU first began, and now with the advantage of a very ambitious and pretty forceful and so far rather effective new French president, will it work?
There are a lot of balls in the air. President Macron is a remarkable person. Already within less than a year in power, he has, I think, imbued. On my last trip to France, I was struck by how there is a new spirit of optimism, particularly among young people, that has been missing for many, many years. In the past, you'd go to France and you'd be struck with this gloom and doom, a sense of national depression, which was only compounded by the horrible terrorist attacks that occurred a few years ago. Now we see with Macron his determination to get France moving again, to push through very difficult reforms, particularly of the labor markets, and so far he's been winning his bet. Now there will be his toughest fights lie ahead. This week he's going to be taking on the train drivers, who have a particularly strong union, the farmers, et cetera. So he has these challenges at home, and of course a lot of the political debate in France is determined by the reactions in the street. And so whether he can keep the protests to a minimum will be crucial to the success of his domestic reform. And he also has a very ambitious foreign policy and a European policy. In foreign policy, we see him going to Saudi Arabia, offering to mediate between the Saudis and Iran. He helped free Saad Hariri, the Lebanese prime minister, who was effectively held hostage there by the Saudis because they were upset by the belief that he was enabling Hezbollah and Iran to control southern Lebanon. And he's also met with Putin, trying to get him to be more cooperative on Ukraine. He's got a lot of other projects at the work, but the most important, I think, will be whether he and Merkel can reach some kind of package deal. And the Germans are very nervous that they will be asked to put their money where their mouth is, and at a time when a lot of their voters are reluctant to spend more money on Europe. And Merkel has to balance this with the risk that the populist nationalist movement known as Alternative for Deutschland, which is growing in the polls, does not gain even further momentum in this respect and possibly become one of the biggest parties in Germany.
Bill, in talking about those countries that have gone hard right, there are a couple of ones you didn't mention. One is the Czech Republic, whose president is a real right-winger. And the other one is a country very close to IPI. We have a relationship with Austria. And the young 31-year-old chancellor, I think he's the youngest head of a government in the world now, Sebastian Kurz is often here. He, as you know, allied with the Freedom Party, which is the really hard right party, to control the Austrian government on an anti-immigrant platform. Right. But what I want to get to is Poland, because this is the one that sort of troubles me the most of all. Poland has done really well by the European Union. It gets enormous amounts of money. When Britain leaves the EU, Poland becomes the 5th largest country in the EU. Right. And yet the Poles are sort of right behind the Hungarians in catching up in doing some pretty odious things. The most recent thing, as you know, was passing a law in Poland that criminalizes ever mentioning that there were Polish collaborators with the Nazis. Right. How can you explain what Poland is doing and why it's doing it?
Well, again, this is a manifestation of a populism, a form of populism by the hard right Law and Justice Party, led by the Kaczynski family. And it's driven largely by the reluctance to take in any Muslim immigrants. And it's ironic that the fiercest opposition comes from those countries that don't have any of these Muslim refugees. But you pointed out the anti-democratic policies of these governments, the suppression of an independent judiciary, the muzzling of a free press that has taken place in Poland and Hungary. And this is something that is particularly odious to Western countries, Germany, the Netherlands, France, who see that Poland, for example, receives 2 billion euros a month in subsidies from the European Union, and yet at the same time they are snubbing these democratic values and refusing to change their policies. So we're heading toward a big clash. There's going to be a big debate about the budget and Merkel has put forward just last Friday at a European summit a proposal that funds that would normally go to Poland and Hungary will now be channeled to those countries who have taken immigrants. And this, of course, has set off a firestorm of anger in the Eastern countries who say that they need it much more than these rich countries. And again, this is an indication of how far, how much the rise of populist nationalism has infected European politics. You mentioned in Austria. Now, Austria is a wealthy country. They're actually a net contributor, but there is an extreme reluctance to take in any Muslim refugees. And this, I think it's important to realize, it sort of reflects the same debate that we've seen with the Trump insistence on building a wall and getting rid of the Dreamers, DACA, and other immigrants. It comes down to identity politics in Europe as a way of generating political support. And this is extremely emotional and extremely dangerous. And if it gets out of control, I think you can see these effects. Because I point out in the book, the last chapter is about the illusion of America first, And I went back in history and looked at what happened after World War I with the creation of the America First movement. And the same policies were followed at the time. The Quota Acts of 1921 and 24 were designed to exclude immigrants. And then came the protectionist policies, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, that led to retaliation by our allies. And the same to policy, anti-immigration legislation in Washington, and now protectionist measures that are being targeted against our allies. This could lead to disasters down the road. I'm not saying it's going to be as bad as the 1930s, but surely we should learn the lessons of history on this.
By the way, these countries, most of them actually need immigrants for the labor force, yes?
Absolutely.
They're not growing
I mean, there's, 10 years ago, Otto Schily, who was then the interior minister for Germany, asked his ministry to produce an annual report showing what does Germany need in terms of immigrants to sustain its economy. And for the past 10 years, they reported that Germany will need at least 400,000 immigrants a year for the next 25 years in order to accommodate the fact that there's been such a demographic shrinking and the fact that families are not having many children. So the need is there for immigrants to come in, and to use these political, really racist arguments is going to come back to hurt Europe economically.
Economically, yeah. Bill, Russia. Obviously, nobody can be more pleased by these developments we're talking about than Vladimir Putin. How much of it do you think he's actually provoked?
Well, it's funny. Chancellor Merkel again became, this was thrust into her lap because President Obama said basically, Angela, you speak Russian, you talk to Putin, I can't deal with this guy. And Putin speaks German because of his time as a KGB agent in Dresden. And during the period of time, nearly 2 years that I was reporting this book, she told me she spoke or met with Putin 70 times. And on each occasion, she was trying to say, look, be rational. One of the successes of the Federal Republic of Germany is that it achieved peaceful and prosperous relations with all 9 of its neighbors. And she said, isn't this a lesson maybe for Russia? Rather than thinking you can gain greater security by destabilizing your neighbors, that's not necessarily going to work. And she pointed out, and furthermore, if I were in your shoes and sitting in the Kremlin, I would think in terms of a strategic challenge, the biggest threat comes from the east, where China is encroaching in Siberia and actually moving some of their population into areas where the Russian border guards can't control it, and Islamic fanaticism coming from the south. And this is not the time to pick a fight with the West. You actually should be trying to work with the West. So sounds like an eminently rational argument, but Putin's view was entirely different. And the reason I believe, anyway, we didn't go into this, but my view is that the kleptocracy around Putin does not think in terms of geopolitical strategy. They're just thinking of clinging to their wealth and holding on to power for as long as they can.
Bill, I want to ask you about anti-Americanism in Europe now. Various polls I've seen, country by country, show that in a country X in Europe, where the U.S. had, say, it was 65% popularity rating, it's now down to like 20%. And that seems to be happening all across Europe. Is that all due to Trump? And once Trump is gone, will respect for America return, or do you think it will be lasting, this anti-Americanism? After all, Merkel herself said, we now know, after talking to Trump the first time, said, we now know we're going to have to take care of ourselves, no longer depend upon that country. And she didn't say that guy.
Right. Well, I think this has been in the works. I don't think it's all Trump. You could see the trend developing really as early as George W. Bush's administration, when French President Chirac and German Chancellor Schroeder tried to dissuade Bush from going to war in Iraq. and they failed, and with all of the terrible consequences that resulted from that colossal blunder, the creation of ISIS after Saddam was toppled, and that's leading to more and more chaos in the Middle East. But I don't think it's so much anti-Americanism. I think it's a realization that 70 years after the creation of the Atlantic Alliance, that Europe has come to the realization that we can no longer depend on the United States as the security umbrella for Europe. And certainly the election of Trump, where he is bashing NATO and holding the allies out as enemies in a commercial sense. And that was when it was after her second meeting with Trump that she came back to Germany and said, perhaps it's time that we take our destiny in our own hands. And I think this is what she and President Macron will try to do. But there is also a realization that you cannot somehow just throw this overboard. Germany is not ready to, for a lot of reasons, because pacifism is deeply impregnated in that culture, is not ready to start spending a lot of money on defense of Europe. And I think they realized a lot of their partners would get nervous about that for obvious historical reasons. So there's going to have to be some kind of a realization that there will need to be that France is willing to do more in terms of military power on defense of Europe, but Germany is going to have to do more to meet France's demands for a banking union, a more integrated financial and monetary project.
You know, you mentioned in your remarks when you were beginning a certain sympathy for Russia or for the strongman rule that Russia represents in some of the Eastern European countries. One of the authors I had here about 2 years ago was a Lithuanian-American author named Agnia Grigas, who wrote a book called Beyond Crimea. And it was about this thing called compatriot protection. It's a fascinating notion, that the Russians will identify populations in the Baltics in particular, in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, who are still Russian-speaking, who have a longing, you know, for the and Putin will say, and the Russians will say, we have to represent them because they are in the minority in these countries, and they will be, you know, acted against unless we compatriot protection, and it seemed to be working. I want to go back to your comment in the very beginning. Do you discover that in certain parts of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, there is a real longing for that kind of strongman rule, a real sympathy for Russia?
Well, I think there's a disillusionment with the traditional ruling parties that have seemed to have lost their way, and we see that in Germany, where in the most recent elections, both the Christian Democrats and Social Democrats had their worst scores since 1949. We saw it in Austria, where the traditional ruling parties have also crumbled, and we're seeing it in Italy today with the rise of these alternative parties, and in Spain, where you know, the socialists and then the moderate right have also lost power. So this is going, and I think again to point out, President Macron recognized this early on. And he basically destroyed the socialists and the old Gaullists and came up with his own movement. And I think he now sees this, that neither right nor left identities work anymore in dealing with political solutions. And this has to be the future approach. He wants to transform this at a European level. But it's going to be extremely difficult because each country has its own reluctance, well, historical reasons. I think Erdogan, for example, says in order to get things done, Hungary needs a strong man. And so he's trying to persuade these people, his people, that he can be much more effective in dealing with their problems. So I think that is the risk that we face. Now, you pointed out about what Russia is maybe up to. one of the chapters is about Latvia, and the capital of Latvia, Riga, is 50% of the population is ethnic Russian and 50% native Latvian. And the ethnic Russians have a case to be made in terms of human rights. They were left behind after 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, and now ethnic Russians born in Latvia do not have the right to vote. So they've even tried to take this to the Council of Europe. So, and Putin has been cleverly playing on these resentments because they're listening to Russian language, television, radio. So this was really, it provided me with a lot of insight into their use of information warfare. And now we've seen how that has played out with the meddling in our election, but also the attempt to meddle in European elections as well.
By the way, one of the strengths of this book is, and I'm going to ask Bill for the title headings in a second, it's written in a way that I think the titles of all the chapters are simply capitals. I know Riga is the capital. What are it's an indication of how many countries he went to and how much he wrote about. do you remember all the?
Yeah, well, I start out, the first chapter is called Berlin, the New Epicenter of Power, how Berlin, Germany, a reunited Germany has emerged as the strongest power, and how it's, on the one hand, reluctant to wield its power in certain ways, but on the other hand is accused of forcing its partners to accept its remedies. And then the second chapter is, there's a chapter on London, the breakaway realm, which is about the story of the Brexit phenomenon. And Paris is called In Search of Lost Glory, which is how France has lost its way under the previous two presidents, is trying to regain it under Macron. Madrid, can the center hold? That focuses on the regional separatism of Catalonia, which is a separate challenge. There's a chapter on Rome called The Eternal City, Forever in Decline, ? And we see that now with the Five-Star Movement came to power in Rome. They captured the mayor's office on the claim that we will clean up the city and get rid of all the garbage. Well, there's still piles of garbage everywhere, and Rome may indeed be ungovernable. But there's a chapter, Warsaw between East and West. I talk about the illiberal democracies, and Greece, life on the edge, where 25% of the population is there's such an economic depression there. It's really sad to see what has happened there. And I mentioned Riga, but I would say the positive news was on Copenhagen, and how it was remarkable. The mayor there said, I would rather be a mayor of Copenhagen than a prime minister of a country because I can have a greater impact. And this was an interesting insight because he's now created a biothermal project, burning waste, heats free of charge 700,000 apartments for 700,000 people. And also they have a very enlightened employment policy. They retrain people constantly. 1 in 4 Danes changes jobs every year. And this is kind of adapting to the demands of the global economy. So there is some positive news in all this.
I was telling one of our guests tonight, who is part Norwegian, that Scandinavia is all over this institute. Look around you, blonde walls, white walls, glass everywhere. It's no accident. Our president, for those of you who saw the play Oslo last year that won the Tony for Best Play, is Terje Rode-Larsen, who was the man, the Norwegian diplomat who created the Oslo peace process, along with his wife, Mona Juul, who today is the Norwegian ambassador to Great Britain. So we always have positive things to say about Scandinavia here. But Scandinavians, if you think of us in the UN community, there are no countries that are more cooperative with what the UN believes in than the countries of Scandinavia. Bill, back to parties. When you were talking about the failure of parties in different countries, I began to think, it's really happening almost everywhere. I mean, Macron had this very clever idea, sort of creating his own vehicle. But it's happening in this country right now. I think the great Democrats' dilemma is how can they find some identity that will attract people so that they can win on more than just being the un-Trump or the anti-Trump.
Absolutely.
But political parties all through the West are just failing to represent people.
No, if I could just point out, I was on the book tour, went through the Midwest, and it was quite an eye-opening experience to see the ravages of this opioid epidemic and talking to the political elites, both Republicans and Democrats, on what to do and what matters to people. And they're also repelled by Washington. You know, the dysfunctionality of Congress, 9% approval rating, the lack of cooperation across the aisle. And so the time is, you know, if our system is rooted in these two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, but I'm convinced that there is a yearning and a hunger out there for something new and fresh of a revolutionary nature, such as Macron had.
Along the same, in Europe, do you think the anti-establishment parties have peaked? I mean, Marine Le Pen, who lost, did get 40 or 34% of the vote.
Yeah.
The Alternative for Deutschland is now, as you say, the second party in Germany. Are they finished, or do you think they're still on the rise?
No, I think any number of things could fuel their continuing rise and influence. And right now, I think the good news is the return of economic growth. The economic recovery could be something that persuades people to stick with the traditional ruling parties. But the question about identity politics, we see that in Germany. People saying, you know, I've lost a sense of my own country. And this, I think, is an important theme in the book, is the backlash against globalization, which we've seen in this country as well as in Europe. And whether it was for economic reasons or for too many refugees coming in, or even for Catalonian separatism, I came away from the 2 years of reporting this book convinced that there is a profound desire on the part of many voters to be governed closer to their own daily lives, be governed by their own communities. And so,
and not by Brussels.
And not by Brussels there, and not by Washington here. I mean, it's interesting when you see Jerry Brown running around Europe saying, we've got our own foreign policy in California, and we believe in climate change, and we want to work with Europe. And cities also coming up with their own policies. So I think that's an interesting challenge to the national power in Washington.
Excellent. I'd love to get some questions and comments from the floor. Join in the conversation. Bill, I think I'll take three at once, and then we can answer them all at the same time. Right. We'll start here in the front row, second row Lynn, and third row Hans. And could I ask you to please identify yourself? By the way, this is all webcast. So the reason I asked you to identify yourself and speak with the microphone is because that camera picks it up back there.
Hi, I'm Dr. Danieli. What about neo-Nazism? We are only 2 generations away after Never Again. Could you comment on that? And also if you comment on the Balkans and Turkey. I mean, that area, that piece of the pie. Thank you.
Okay, and I think Lynn, the second one.
You've given us some wonderful history and reportage, and thank you for that. Could we get you to extrapolate a little bit and suggest where you think these trends might go over the next decade or so? I mean, left, right, and
okay.
And then just pass it to Hans, if you will.
Yeah, I was struck by the fact that you mentioned that the popularity of the United States in Europe had dropped to about 20%.
I think I said that, but that's
You
just
said that.
polls
It
I've
doesn't
read.
matter. Both geniuses say the same. But wouldn't they recognize in those countries that the United States is actually becoming more and more like them? There is such a huge identity between Kentucky and Poland, as far as I'm concerned. And I'm surprised that that's not identified and that they don't identify more with the United States than they have before.
Want to take those 3 questions, then we'll get 3 more.
Yeah, okay, fine. Well, sure. Well, on the neo-Nazi attitudes, I think, it's really the intolerance. I don't think you're going to see the return of what we saw in the 30s. But the intolerance and that we see among populist nationalists is a reflection, in a way, of what the attitudes that we saw in the 30s. And the neo-Nazi movement, a lot of them, whether they're skinheads or thugs, what scares me is the intolerance toward minorities, whether it be Muslim minorities, but gays, and there's a disturbing trend about, and why this is happening to such a profound degree. Again, it gets back into political identities, that a lot of these people find. And there's been a lot of research done on this, that they find some kind of a camaraderie of really thuggish thinking in this area. So I think it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of luck in terms of the economic return. You mentioned the Balkans. The Balkans there's a very tenuous truce there. I think the European Union is exploring the idea when that will be the next phase of enlargement. So, but whether these countries are ready to do that is still questionable. Serbia, Croatia is already a member of the European Union and NATO. Slovenia, of course, is. But Serbia has a very strong Russian connection, and already you see disturbing signs that Putin and his people are influencing that. And not just there, already in Bulgaria and Romania, a lot of Russian oligarchs have bought up the media properties and are affecting the political climate. So Russia is the challenge of Putin is going to, I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges for Europe at a time when the United States, under Trump, certainly doesn't have any idea what to do in terms of Russia. It's going to be up to our European friends to have a more coherent policy. And really, it's going to be managing Russia's decline because of demographics, the emphasis on oil and gas, at a time when more and more cars are going to be using other forms of fuel. So Russia is going to be going into a phase of persistent decline, and how we manage this decline of Russia at a time when it will be tempted to break out and try to exercise power in dangerous ways is going to be quite a challenge. You may ask me to look into a crystal ball, predict the future. I've always been reluctant to do that as a journalist. Warren, when we were both foreign editors, we always warned our reporters never to do that. But anyway, I'll live dangerously. I would say the most optimistic scenario would be to see the European institutions try to retrench and deepen the most important fundamental elements, such as the customs union, trade, and forego, at least for the time being, some of these grandiose ideas of a common foreign policy or a common European army, because a lot of time and words and think tanks have been wasted on this. They need to get back to resolving issues that are important to their citizens. And I would, in this light, I think the most important thing is for give the next generation faith in the European project. I mean, when you go to Spain, you see 50% of young people under the age of 30 still struggling to find sustainable jobs. It's now in places like Italy, Greece, Spain. They have what's called a lost generation, people who are now approaching 40 because they haven't been able to get a serious job, just floating from contract work to contract work, can't start families. High number of young men still live with their parents in their, even if they're past 40. So it's this is very troubling. What do they do with the younger generation? And I think those are the challenges. And to start thinking about a post-American world, because I don't think, even when I was in the Midwest, a lot of thoughtful people told me, including a Republican governor of Ohio, who was going to run for president in 2020, said, you know,
John Casey.
John Casey, and he said, I like Europe, I believe in the alliance, but 70 years after, we have so many problems here, and in our community, we just cannot afford to be the world's policeman and the security guarantor. I mean, we were in his office, and he said, a report just came on my desk. It says 5 million people in Ohio gain their livelihoods from long-distance truck driving. He says, this report says by 2030, in 13 years, long-distance truck driving will be obsolete because of driverless technology. He says, so what do me or my successors do in terms of dealing with the political fallout from this? Because if you think we have a polarized society now, think what it's going to be like when these breakthroughs in technology start costing people their jobs. And truck driving is pretty affluent job. I mean, you're making close to $100,000 in many of these. And so a lot of these families depended on this. And now that's going to be disappearing.
You know, I'm thinking as you talk also, and this is generational, the European Union has a terrible image. You mention the EU to anybody who's, say, less than about 65 years old, and all they think about is bureaucracy and distance from real power and from their capital. You really have to be somebody our age and older to have any sense of what Europe was before and how the EU was created to forestall that ever happening again. The continent that in 1 century had these two gigantic world conflagrations. There is no way in the world that a European less than 50 years old can have any sense of that. So his or her image of the European Union is a bunch of bureaucrats shuffling papers in Brussels and not paying attention to their real needs. And that's, I'm not quite sure how you get the image back. I'm afraid you can't get it back by appealing to what you and I know, is that had it not been for the European Union, we might have had another world war or two. I mean, it did forestall.
Well,
it was a successful and noble experiment in that
There
sense.
was one more, I forgot the U.S. attitudes question. I think it's important to bear in mind that when you see these polls saying, 20%, only 20% support the United States, on the ground, the scene is quite different. I mean, there are people and parties that adore Trump. Berlusconi, I often explain, he's our Berlusconi in a way. And so you have right-wing people like Orban of Hungary admires Trump. And you see at the same time a lot of admiration that Europeans have toward parts of the United States, like Silicon Valley. I was struck by how Macron is saying that he wants to lure a lot of these young French people back and there's now a reservoir of about 80,000 young French people who have settled in the greater Northern California area because they're very well schooled in mathematics, and so a lot of these American Silicon Valley companies want to hire them, and they enjoy the weather and wine culture in the Napa Valley. So he's appealing to them to come back. Some of them are attracted to that, but so there is admiration, but there's also a feeling of repulsion toward the dysfunctionality of our politics in Washington.
Any more questions? All the way in the back, an old friend, and then there, a new friend, and another new friend in the front. So 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was incredibly interesting. My name is Margaret Williams. I work for the World Federation of UN Associations, but I used to work at IPI, and it's great to be back. Two quick questions. First, on the employment issue. You mentioned that Europe would do very well to employ the large number of immigrants coming in. So my question is, what are they getting wrong in their messaging to the larger masses that are angry with immigration? What's wrong with the messaging? What's wrong with the policy? And have you seen any kind of positive examples of policy in terms of employment and possibly AI and technology advancements? Second question is more generic, and it's just, what kind of political hope do you see for Italy?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There we are, number two.
Hello, my name's Mark Francis. I'm a New Yorker. I've been here for 30 years. I'm also British and European. And I have a question about, or I would like to know your opinion about something about Brexit. The European Union is a club, a very exclusive club, which Britain actually tried very hard and failed to get into in the 1960s. De Gaulle, in particular France, rejected us. We fought very hard, we got in. We paid a huge initiation fee. Just like any club, you pay an initiation fee. Then you pay annual dues. Our dues were very high. Higher, proportionally, Britain at least thinks, than they should have been. The country is elected to leave. I personally disagree with it. I think it's a terrible decision, but they did. Now we're being asked to pay a penalty. I don't know of any club that you leave where you pay a penalty to leave.
Okay, and the third was here in the front row.
Okay, having spent a lot of my life.
Wait for the microphone, Jim.
Okay, having spent a lot of my life around this institution across the street and places like the Carter Center, and working on problems
Jim, hold it up a
all
little
over the
closer.
world,
Yeah.
all over the world in terms of that require foreign aid. What's the empathy in Europe for all the programs that they have supported historically across the globe? Because there's great momentum in solving a lot of things like global health issues and so forth. What now? What does this mean for that?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, on the first question, I think it's important to look at this. What is making people fearful of immigrants is really the anxiety. They think their own culture is being diluted, and that they see state money. I mean, Belgium, for example, funds the creation of mosques, and people are saying, well, why is my tax money going to this? And they see a lot of, large families that are being subsidized with their tax money. So that is creating a lot of resentment. And I don't know how this is going to be resolved. I think you're already seeing, like Chancellor Merkel's government, cracking down on immigration, even deporting a lot of recent refugees, and we're likely to see that happening. Macron himself is taking a tougher attitude as well. So I think the mainstream parties, in order to recapture their standing, are probably going to move further and further to right on these immigration issues, even if that's going to come at a cost of the economy. Because after all, a lot of what Germany has discovered is that a lot of the young early immigrants were thought to be well-schooled doctors, engineers, but the training levels were not adequate. And also teaching the language and all this. The cultural assimilation is very difficult. It's a real challenge. Brexit, whether it's penalty, well, depends on what side of the argument. The European Union says Britain had already committed to paying, let's say, pensions for its the Brits who were members of the European elite. In terms of the farming policy. So it's basically winding down these policies and paying what they believe is owed. Now, Britain is claiming, no, we're being, this is extortionate and it can't happen. But there are other larger issues. I think the biggest concern right now is what's going to happen with the border of Northern Ireland. Is that going to lead to an explosion because the destruction of the Good Friday Accords? A lot of people in both Ireland and Britain are worried about it.
Which, by the way, is 20 years old next month. I covered it, so I remember very, very well.
Right.
The
Yeah,
Good Friday
exactly.
Agreement, 1998.
Okay, and then let's see, what was the last question?
One more thing on
That's right, I remember
but I
now.
was going to say, going to add one point you said about the consequence for Britain. I think the other thing to watch is the City of London. It could really suffer.
Right.
If Frankfurt and Dublin and others succeed. Even Rotterdam right now is in the race to try to take away that business.
Well,
that
and,
could be a real...
and not just the banks. I mean, for example, the Japanese investors, Toyota, that had built these car plants in Sunderland, which voted in favor of leave. Mm-hmm. They are now talking of packing up and moving to the continent. So this is going to have a serious economic penalty for Britain, just on investors. Just on your point about the global policies and economic development. I mean, Europe, I think, it has a justified case in saying that we spend a lot of money. It's not fair to say, we have to spend 2% on military hardware. A lot of, if it weren't for the European Union and spending more than $1 billion in aid to the occupied territories, Gaza and the West Bank, I mean, it would be a humanitarian disaster there in the Middle East and elsewhere as well. And then I think, but this debate gets this awkward. They say, why doesn't the United States spend more on global health issues? Well, if you factor in, if you factor in the private donations, so let's say the Gates Foundation and others that have been doing work in Africa and Haiti and other places of hardship, it's quite impressive. We happen to do a lot of funding through tax-free foundations for these policies that Europe doesn't, has their governments take care of. So it's a different style.
But time for 3 more questions. This gentleman here, that gentleman there, and that woman back there. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll make it 4 questions.
Daniel had a question too.
Thank you. My name is Shahid Hussain. I'm a UN retiree, presently advising the UN Office for South-South Cooperation. So this is actually a follow-up question to point raised from the floor a moment ago. In Britain, the calls...
Shall you hold the microphone up a little closer?
Yes,
Thank you.
Indeed. In Britain, the calls for a second referendum seem to be becoming increasingly audible. Does that mean that the spirit of Brexit is mellowing down? And if so, what do you think are the strikingly main factors influencing that? Thank you.
All right.
Where was number 2? Oh, right here, Lawrence.
Lawrence Moss, thank you so much for this excellent talk. I want to take off from the question posed to you by Governor Kasich about the effect of automation on American jobs. In America, the inequality problem is particularly bad because the benefits of this greater productivity flow to the owners of capital, and we seem to be distributing income upwards rather than downwards in this country. But what are Europeans thinking about this? I know Finland is experimenting with guaranteed annual income in the manner that Andrew Stern has proposed for the United States. Are there other solutions in Europe that will be able, that might teach Governor Kasich and others here as to how we're to deal with a world in which so many people's work is really not needed?
Yeah.
All right. Carol?
Tonight's fantastic. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yeah, but just introduce yourself.
I'm Carol Delouvrier, and I'm just a big fan of yours. And very nice to be here. My question is this to you. If you had dinner after tonight with President Donald Trump, what would be the one question you would ask him?
Oh, boy.
And then, right, oh, I'm sorry.
Daniel had a question.
Yeah.
Hi, yes. Thank you for the fourth question.
Yeah.
I'm Daniel Jott, and I was wondering if you could actually elaborate on something that you touched on in your last answer, which is Macron's new policy towards asylum, which to an untrained eye seems to be a kind of very tentative tightrope walk between left and right, to the point of even exporting asylum cases to countries of origin rather than having them be decided in France. And I'm wondering if you see that as something that will be a successful solution or perhaps a path forward to a migrant problem in Europe, or if that is in fact not something that would be advisable to pursue.
Daniel, at the risk of embarrassing you personally, when I saw the name Judd on the list, Daniel's father, Tony Judd, was one of the finest thinkers about Europe there has simply ever been. He died 3-4 years ago, I guess now. Much missed, but anyway, I'm delighted you're here. And I asked Bill beforehand if you knew if you were a real Judd, and of course you are. Welcome, please.
All right. The first question, will there be a second referendum on Brexit? If you look at on the face of things, you would think there would be a huge surge in popular demand for a second referendum, particularly among young people who are going to be suffering the most. And it was one aspect of Cameron's blunder, which he has never explained, is that on choosing the date of 23rd June, it was the week he was confident he would win hands down because he thought he would get 90% of the youth vote. But he scheduled it during the week of final exams for all universities in Britain. And it was a Thursday, and then the next day was a long weekend, and they were of the Glastonbury Music Festival. So the young people were either studying feverishly for their exams or going out partying, getting hammered, and in advance of the music festival. So sure enough, like 28% only turned out, and that was enough to cost the election. No, I think everybody I talk to, all my British friends, whether they're in Leave or Remain, they say that things have gone too far now, and I'm surprised that they say that it's gone so far now. It will continue. Now there are a couple.
Jeremy Corbyn, who, as you said, even Jeremy Corbyn, who has just announced.
If there is a new
not
election,
calling for a second referendum, he's saying, we'll accept the verdict, but we'll just make it the softest Brexit possible.
Right. Yeah. So I think I don't see that happening. Even if there is a new election, it'll be something of that sort. What should be done? Well, I think one of the most positive thing. How do we deal? Kasich, I told him about what I had discovered in Denmark, and he said that's a great idea. I mean, Denmark, for example, spends 18 times as much per capita as the United States on retraining people during the course of their lives. And I think we need to open up our educational system to the fact that in order to, you can no longer graduate from college and think you're going to work for one firm or one company for 40 years and then get a nice pension. Those days are over. So you now have to be prepared to reinvent yourself throughout your life. And one of the people I admired, a former French Prime Minister, Michel Rocard, who became a friend, and he spent his last years in the European Parliament trying to promote this idea that universities should be a place you go, you learn one job, but then you go back for 4 or 5 years when you're 40, 45 and learn another profession. And so that you are reinventing yourself, so that you don't get stuck in a dead end. Let's say you become a lawyer and you hate your work. Well, you can go off and study and become an architect. But opening up lifelong possibilities for lifelong education, I think, is the way to.
And of course, lifelong is going to be much longer now, soon, than it is right now.
And I think that's where we have to start developing some of these innovative policies to prepare people, particularly with digital technologies. changing so dramatically that we're going to have to adapt quickly. What would I ask Donald Trump? God, there's so many questions, but I said, how many, should we have friends? Do you believe that we should have allies and friends in the world, or do you think America can go it alone? And
That's a good question.
I can't imagine if he believes in this America first. He says it doesn't mean America alone, but that's what it's turning out to be. Because we're alienating so much of the rest of the world, and most importantly of all, our closest allies, not just in Europe, but also in Asia as well.
Which I think, Hans, is why those polls are showing 20% support for the U.S., because that particular policy of treating allies as rivals or enemies is just turning off people in America.
Right. Well, and when you contrast that, I mean, I remember European friends who were saying, you know, the ability of America to reinvent itself is something that they admired the most, and they saw this. They despised George W. Bush, largely because of the Iraq invasion. And then from that, we turned around and elected Barack Obama, who was wildly popular in Europe. And they said, how could America do this, go from one to Obama in one election? And, you know, at the time, there was this tremendous outpouring of enthusiasm toward America coming from Europe over the Obama
Can I mention something else on that same point? I lived and worked in Britain for 8 years. I was the Times correspondent there. And I remember a member of Tony Blair's government, a man called Peter Mandelson, who crafted the whole government, went one day out to California. He was then the Minister for Industry or something, and came back and lectured his fellow Britons on saying, in America, you can fail and somebody comes along and gives you money to start and do it again. And he was saying, we don't do that in Britain. And I think he could have said, we don't do that in Europe that much. Right. But that was an American aspect that so many Europeans admired.
Well, no, you're right. It's like a badge of honor if you fail, and then you learn from your experience, and then you go on to create some. Whereas if you fail let's say, in Germany with a startup, you'll never get money invested in you from any bank forever. Daniel's question about, I think this is one of the most tricky and challenges that any politician faces in sort of navigating how to do the right thing in terms of policies on asylum and refugees. In Macron's case, I think he's now saying that refugees who sneak in through the Alps are now going to be jailed for a year. I think his view is that you need to discourage this unchecked immigration coming in, but also politically, you can't open up the gates for the far right to acquire greater support from voters. And this isn't just in places like France, where Marine Le Pen, who I think is becoming a spent force, and her party is squabbling and may split. But other countries, in Denmark, for example, which we all think of as a very progressive, enlightened society, they've had passed a law, the jewelry law, in which every immigrant coming in would have all valuables confiscated above $1,000, ostensibly to help pay for their care. And I remember the Danish ambassador told me, he says, yeah, I went to the interior minister. I said, this is a terrible policy because it's damaging our reputation abroad. And she said, yes, I know. Isn't that great? Because her intention was to spread the word that if you come to Denmark, all of your values will be confiscated. And so they even took out advertisements in Lebanon and Syria in the newspapers there to tell people this as a way of discouraging them from coming. So,
Bill, you're a font of good stories, and this has been fascinating having you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.